Our third and final speaker for this session is the one and only Lissa Holloway-Attaway. I'm sure many of you know her already, but while she's setting up, I will read out her biography.
Thank you.
Lissa is a senior lecturer at BTH in English and Digital Culture, where she teaches interdisciplinary humanities courses. Her research is within American literature and digital media studies, with a special emphasis on social and emergent media, material aesthetics and performance. Her research has been presented at numerous international conferences, and she has received grants and awards in media art and culture and in electronic pedagogy. She has recently published work on social media aesthetics, digital cartography, and performative feminist discourse on social media sites. In the fall of 2011, she will be a visiting researcher artist at the Post-Humanities Hub at Linköping University and at NIDA Art Colony in Lithuania, working on mapping and mobile AR projects, including a remapping of Melville's classic American novel Moby Dick onto the city space of Karlskrona. And she is working on a book manuscript about performance, embodiment, and emergent media practice. Ladies and gentlemen, Lissa Holloway-Attaway.
Thank you. Well, had I known that I would be following the foreskin projects, I might have prepared some differently. I do have to say, I think that wives imagining their husbands in coffins is a rather timeless phenomena. One that I myself may have indulged in, which is probably why I'm now single. But I don't know, I was very provoked by both Jay's talk and Dimitri's talk because of the references to augmented reality, augmented space, the rethinking of the human body in the face of technology, and all of these sorts of hybrids of physical space, virtual spaces, physical bodies, technical bodies, which are such complex philosophical questions. And even though the works that David mentioned that I'm going to be developing in the fall are actually with the Argonne browser that Jay showed to creative applications, I wanted to talk about a different kind of augmentation of reality today, but in the context of these others, and that's actually to think more about social media and the ways in which social media creates a kind of aesthetic, has allowed us to question or to think about the new kinds of aesthetics that are created via these media forms. I'm sorry, I'm just going to try to, oh, interesting. Okay, well, we're going to do this a slightly different way then. So I'm going to just talk about some of the works that we have. But the title of my talk, Screenplay, and Screenplaying as I'll talk, really references a number of different practices where in thinking about the space of the screen and how that space may come to be reconfigured through social media and the way in which it engages us in a kind of playful or kind of recursive practices, but that also often have very significant social sorts of contexts that are associated with them as well. So I am particularly interested, as I said, in thinking about inscription, questions of inscription, and thinking about the ways in which we inscribe within highly hypermediated environments, that is the contemporary and convergent environments that we are often confronted with today, not only then starting through social media spaces, but also thinking about those other kinds of urban spaces and the ways in which we are increasingly finding ourselves within a sort of a deeply intertwined physical virtual space or a kind of a mediascape. I really love the word, the sort of the digital media ecology as it's often referred to, because I think it really helps us think about the ways in which the ecological dimensions of media is present as a growing and kind of influential series of networking possibilities between real bodies and virtual bodies, so that if we look, for example, and I won't show you the videos, but you can certainly find them, a work like Lozano Hemmer's Body Movies, which allows people in physical urban spaces to create through the phenomena of just walking, create in large-scale, monstrous kinds of constructions, cast their shadows across videos of other passerbys and to replace their faces with the ones that are there in front of them. This kind of Talon talked about a kind of a pedestrian agency in terms of creating art is very interesting to me because it engages the passerby in the participation of an artwork, sometimes even without their knowledge, but often through what is considered a sort of a mundane kind of action, and encourages a kind of media participation that I think is interesting and that could only happen through the active agency, the organic agency of the moving body. So I find a work like this interesting to think about, as I said, as I come back to think about the inclusion of social media. If we look at these other kinds of works that are often are very formally attempting to mix physical spaces with virtual spaces, and also to create these sort of hybrid genres that can only be facilitated through the advent of social media, then I think we really feel these sort of deeply embedded convergent worlds that many people have been talking about today in terms of where is the body, where's the nature of the organic, and what kind of genre are we talking about when we think of a site like this and we begin to think of where is the screen, where is the space for display that's happening. In an environment like this, we see the sorts of text bubbles on the building facade. It's important that we see the building facade. It's not being hidden. It's acting as a kind of screen, but an unfamiliar one. We are meant to see the framing of the windows as they sort of happen in to recognize the window itself as always a reference point for framing. But then we also see, as I say, these little text bubbles that the way they operate is that somebody via an SMS message is actually sending the content into the text bubbles as they appear on the window. So it creates a kind of participatory, collaborative media experience. Again, people through the sort of what might be a mundane action of sending a text message can participate within the artwork itself. But the text balloon reminds us that the work is one that is dynamic. There is a sense of liveness being provoked within this work, while at the same time it recalls other kinds of media forms and makes us actively conscious of meaning making from the mundane. I would like a hot chocolate, somebody texting that, all the way to what could be considered political commentary. You don't control and you don't create a kind of hierarchical distance between those two. So again, this is a very kind of contemporary form of media. And so to contextualize and just to kind of give a theoretical perspective up front, and then we'll look at some examples once we sort of get past my premise, which is to say that if one is to track the organic human being or sense of beingness within contemporary media forms, I think one way to start is to think about the concept of the screen. And what is the screen? How does one recognize the screen? And I have sort of found that working, a term that I use, screenic, with the emphasis on the sort of reiterative and recursive nature of screenwriting, that it's dynamic, that it changes, but that also to show what I think is, in terms of the hybrid genres, a mix between what might be more familiar as thinking of a screen from a cinematic tradition, which is that the screen becomes a holding place for content, a text space or a box, a content space on which content is inscribed and which holds that information for us, but also working with the sense of a scene, which comes from a theatrical tradition wherein we consider the action to be live, more dynamic, and less necessarily defined through the nature of a screen. Of course, we have, theater traditions like we do now. But if we pull both of them together and think about how contemporary media ultimately maybe purely what we call purely social media or social media hybrids that work like the architectural pieces we see, become sites of reflection where they are places where one inscribes either through text message or hashtags or by sending pictures up to a Flickr screen, as well as an embodied scene, one that reminds us of the living organism behind the action that's being written. Social media exists because it's not accidental that it's called social media. There's a social dimension to it. It's not intended to be a place merely for distribution. It's meant to be a place for exchange, as I talk about. So that again, I propose that looking for the human body is a way to understand how agency or production can happen within contemporary media environments. And I also think it's a site from which you can begin to establish or define, again, not that there is any one, but you can begin to find the negotiated switches between thinking where the interfaces between the technical and the human sort of exist, and it becomes this sort of sense of playful screenplaying. So that again, another work from Textual Healing, and a group that works a lot with text messages being confronted onto these architectural spaces. I won't go through them in detail, but just to say, if we look at the one on the far right there, that the Jesus Saves is a way of rethinking the notion of graffiti or writing, makes us conscious of another form, but puts it in a sort of dynamic setting. The one at the top, again, one is encouraged to send a text message to fill in the space of the Captain America. What does he say? I mean, hi, Paul, how are you? Again, it doesn't necessarily match, but there's a sense of liveness, and it evokes earlier traditions of like the graphic novel or the comic book, wherein mixed media was already happening, or the one at the bottom, which is actually called Sexual Healing, it's a video that runs on a wall that simulates a woman having sex. So I guess there was some sort of sexy content in mine as well, that simulates a woman in the act of having sex, a video that's generated, but you are supposed to put in what she's thinking in the text bubble. Sometimes she's really thinking, I would like a glass of hot chocolate, but in this case, you're saying something else. So it's the kind of playfulness with media and genre. Or another work that I really love that reminds us again, that takes the text message to a different dimension and reminds us of this kind of organic process of, which I'm talking about, the notion of bodies, so that even though a text message may be sent in order to be projected onto this building, the artist works by translating the text messages into American Sign Language, and so that the hands and arms themselves emerge from the windows and sign the messages. Again, that sense of the trace or the memory of the body that's present, and that reworks the sense coming out of the building itself. From those, we get to other applications where if we think about organicism and we think about social media practices and the way they've reworked what it is that we make and why we make it, we might be able also to think of this phenomena of planking, which you may know, where, again, an art form that one may think of, an aesthetic production form that one may think of as being particularly, although it's not exclusive to social media, it was certainly developed within that, where it really works. It started as Facebook groups and Twitter groups and went on to YouTube videos, where people just take pictures of, or have people take pictures of themselves in these horizontal positions in different kind of sites and settings. Again, the kind of the defamiliarizing of the body by making it do something unnatural in a context which doesn't exist, and documenting it is, again, an interesting way, and the need to produce and to circulate and exchange that. And the fact that it becomes a kind of internet meme reminds us, again, of the kind of the pushing through, the foregrounding of the personal, the body. And again, it can take many different forms. If you want to, you can plank on a camel. You can plank in lots of different places. In fact, it's not only happening within real spaces. You can, following as the movement increased, we can have virtual planking. So you can, so it takes the phenomena that happens in the real world and transfers it into a social media setting. Again, as a sense of playfulness, as a sense of lack of loyalty to genre, as a sense of reminding us that, again, the negotiation between the real and the physical world is not particularly sort of different. So we can think of, a term that I like to use a lot in teaching and in my own research, which is thinking about the idea of the producer, the blend of the producer and the consumer, and the ways in which the producer and the consumer come together to create a shared knowledge base. Even if we think about planking as something that might seem mundane, it's a collaboratively sort of crowdsourced phenomena, and the publication, the sharing, the use of it, that's really bypasses traditional industrial media production and media art. when, again, one thinks of what these aesthetics are and what kinds of aesthetics that you might have. You might think, for example, that planking doesn't have, if we think of aesthetics as a kind of set of rules or conventions that dictate our artistic practice, you could think that planking is something silly, and in some ways it is, but it's interesting to see the way, this is off the Facebook planking page, that tells us there are rules for what you must do. And one of the ones that I think is so interesting is number 4. You must make it known that you are planking. Saying, "I am planking," usually gets this across. Sternly announcing it will assure a good result. I mean, the sense of, again, of documenting, of isolating, of capturing the moment of production somewhere in there, I think is interesting. And then, the nomenclature at the end. Every plank that is captured must be named. And so we can think of these as just sort of funny phenomena, but it's interesting how when they circulate, a social conversation then results. For example, planking very recently was accused in the media, and there was a sort of storm on Twitter and in other spaces where people began to suggest that planking itself was nothing to laugh at because its roots were actually in the slave trade, when slaves on slave ships were sent into rows and chained in the form of planking, and that it referenced that and was and that people were making fun of it in the media, and it started with a rapper, sort of, I can't remember who, not that I would know anyway, who necessarily twittered that it was about, and then the controversy, was it true or was it not true? Whether or not it has its roots in that, then I don't think we can necessarily say for sure, but the fact is that important conversations sometimes follow these events that may seem sort of silly and which question the aesthetics and the practices of distributing them. But in fact, when we talk about aesthetics at all and social media, we have real problems. Because in fact, if you want to go to YouTube, you can find videos of, a 23-second video of a panda sneezing that might have millions of views. Why, one would say, and what is this phenomena? Or you can find the panda cam, and of course you can find the ever popular lolcats, who actually, lolcat phenomena, putting text images on top, putting a text on top of a picture, again, may seem silly, and it is, of course, silly, but it, it has its own sort of linguistic rules and conventions. There is a lolcat translation project of the Bible, which is quite hilarious, actually, to look at, but it is a sense of this kind of, this producing that happens on the internet and that happens within social media and is enabled through these practices and creates a kind of participatory media event that makes us, I think, rethink, who are the artists and what are the perspectives that we can have? Who's in control, and perhaps what are we looking at? If we think of, other phenomena like Twitter, like the whole concept of the Twitterverse, the fact that we call a blogosphere and a Twitterverse itself brings into the concept that there is a frame being drawn around the social media world. It is a Twitterverse evoking the universe or the materiality of the universe, but it also has a kind of rhetorical properties potentially with its compressed 140 characters of poetry and poetic conventions. It displaces us and it makes us actually profoundly within our new lives change our practices. I was thinking earlier that I didn't, I'm sure that Martin might have, but I didn't think about a hashtag for our event and how we would promote the hashtag through our event on Twitter and how we would do this. But we begin to adopt these practices and we begin to speak in these foreign languages, this kind of bird talk. It makes our practices unfamiliar, defamiliar to us, and then foregrounds our need to communicate, again, through this tweeting, this bird talk, a new environment so that we tweet our locations. Yeah, that's Imran. You're in the background of my photo. That not on purpose, but that this idea of standing in one location, holding a screen, looking at it, and tweeting my location for others who may share my map, even though I may be doing something quite mundane like standing outside, or I'm buying milk, or I can hold a map up and I can watch myself walk through the radar blip of the Google map. And so I'm sure many of us have done that. When you discover the blip follows you through, this kind of sense of putting your body in motion and watching it as it moves through a space, I think, is very different and shows us that we have very defamiliarized reading practices, writing practices, signification, and the ways that we make meaning. We have David Prater, who posed for me here. It is, in fact, you didn't know what it was for, did you? Brave New World. But the idea of how are we reconstructed, and where is where's the human face on these works, somewhere in there. So we know that language is always playful. This idea of I am here, where have we been located, are we in media, are we in the real world? This says I am here, standing in this location, familiar, but I'm not really there because, as we know, the arrow is not there. This is not here. The treachery of images has gone on within artworks for a long time. And we can play again with the idea of what does it mean, who are we when we operate, so that we have a kind of a new embodied perspective here. Earlier, Talon referenced the Alberti's window. Well, I suggest Alberti's window here, where it's not a perspective framing, where we are trying to show reality, but where we are instead framing an experience that happens in a new kind of embodied and unfamiliar way. Okay, well, I would just say, because I'm very quickly going to sum up, that again, so this, if we can call aesthetics, and what are the rules, we often find that the key to many of these is not the production of an artifact per se meant for professional or artistic consumption. It's the sharing and exchange of a feeling, the body, again, is very present, as we can see here. That's not the actual name of the video, but somebody else sending this video around of this rather large man with rather large breasts who is dancing around in his bedroom to the song My Humps. And we wonder what that is. It's a private experience that's gone public, but that reminds us through its dynamic and its motile action that there are humans involved, and there's a kind of a organic sensuality in the making of meaning, or can be, sometimes in overt ways. Richard Gruson talks about in his work premediation in a much more sort of dark way, and talking about post 9/11 context, how we use social media to create affect and create feedback loops. But then we can take, as I say, another example where it might feel, and I won't show you the video, but you go look for Lego Whale if you want to. It's a 55-second video that seems to have no narrative, no form. It's a man moving a Lego whale through the screen for 55 seconds, just re-articulating the whale as it moves through. In the background, you can see he's in sort of a dorm room or a domestic setting, a domestic everyday context with laundry hanging. And just sort of wants to show, as he says, here's a whale I built in Lego last night. I'm quite happy with the result, but some improvement could be done, especially on the face, making it less fragile, but that represents reality. And he goes on to say again, so he makes an object in the real world and wants to share the aesthetics of his object in the virtual world and asks for input. And he actually, gets it. People say, great whale. Nice whale. we like your whale. Of course, there are always haters on YouTube, and other people don't say that, but surprisingly not that many. And I think, well, you can see here 9,000 views or something of why. And again, I go back to, what's the phenomena that makes us think about these creations, but how do they then at least make us think about sort of the human side and the playfulness of creating aesthetic objects that we want to share and that we want to exchange. So thank you very much.